There's going to be a lot of crossover between what I say and what Duncan has just said, and also what other presenters have said today, so you'll forgive me for going last. So, I'm going to talk about Mount Rothwell. I work for Odonata Foundation, who own and run Mount Rothwell, and I'm going to talk about how Mount Rothwell was established and what we use it for now. So, while I was getting this slide ready, I was coming up with a map to try and show you where Mount Rothwell was, and I was just zooming in using Google Earth from memory, and I stopped here because this is a great view of what we're dealing with. So Mount Rothwell is here, Brisbane Ranges, the bottom of Lerderderg State Park, metropolitan Melbourne and Geelong, and this view just shows what a fragmented landscape we are dealing with in Western Victoria. So we have Mount Rothwell, and it abuts the Grampian Ranges there. So Mount Rothwell is a 470 hectare island in a hostile matrix. It's really what we've got here. So I opened with that map because it was just a very stark indication of what we're dealing with in Victoria. I'll talk a little bit about Odonata Foundation. So it's a not-for-profit charity. We have about 14 full-time employees. We have 12 casual guides. So four of those full-time employees work just at Mount Rothwell. All those casual guides also work at Mount Rothwell, and they're doing weekend work, and they're doing tours of the sanctuary, which nighttime tours, spotlighting tours, and also educational tours during the day with school groups. We also have a group of about 30 volunteers, and the volunteers are the people who get the work done at Mount Rothwell. It's a very good volunteer program, which I'll talk a bit about later. And we have no government support. We're self-funded. We apply for grants just like everyone else does. And we probably have 2 full-time staff whose job it is to generate income for us. We also generate income at Mount Rothwell in particular through some unusual means. You may be familiar with the TV show Scrublands. That was filmed partially at Mount Rothwell. So it's a good income stream for us as well. And we also do research. So we don't have capacity in-house to consistently do research, so we partner with universities and other groups to do research at Rothwell and at our other properties. Right now, one of our volunteers who's studying a master's degree is doing his research at Mount Rothwell. So that's research we do there. So a little bit of history on Mount Rothwell. Originally occupied by the Wadawurrung people, and this is where we pause to acknowledge their deep connection to the land at where Mount Rothwell is now located. Of course, early 1800s, European settlement came to the area, clearing land, creating pasture, creating croplands. In 1859, it was bought by the Chirnside family. They're famously known for the Werribee Mansion, wealthy landholders in the Western District. In 1872, the homestead was built at Mount Rothwell, the Mount Rothwell homestead, and if you like intrigue and scandal, you can look up exactly why that homestead was built and who actually lived there. I'm not going to go any deeper into it. By the late 1800s, the area had been converted to pasture and crop, and it basically resembles what it is today. In year 2000, the site was bought by Dr. John Walmsley, who built the Earth Sanctuary, what was called the Earth Sanctuary. And I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong, but he was the first person who really showed that if we want small mammals, native mammals, to persist in the environment, we need to build a fence to keep out the predators. In 2004, the property was acquired by Nigel Sharp and what is now the Odonata Foundation. So I'll talk about how Mount Rothwell and how Odonata generally creates havens for native mammals. So first of all, it's secure land of a high ecological value. So if you've got an animal in mind that you want to preserve, you need to put a sanctuary where it's going to be suitable for it. Obviously, we can't have dolphins at our sanctuary, so if you've got an animal in mind, choose the land. If you don't have an animal in mind, at least choose the land that's going to be potentially, it has high ecological value. So that's a closer map of the Mount Rothwell Sanctuary. It has 3 broad areas, which we talk about when we're working there: the grassy woodlands, the rocky outcrops, and the basalt grasslands. So we're actually on the border of 2 bioregions, and we have potentially 5 ecological vegetation classes within the sanctuary. So that's pre-European settlement, of course, but it's potentially a very diverse area. So we can potentially do a lot of things there. Of particular note is the grassy woodlands. So that's actually old growth forest. It's never been cleared. And the Churnsides kept that forest intact to provide shelter for their lambing ewes, but inadvertently preserved a piece of original forest. And it's quite a unique bit of forest. There's some fascinating and ancient mallee growth form eucalypts in there, which surprises people, including myself. It's also remarkably resistant to invasion of pest animals and weeds. The niches in the grassy woodlands are already filled, so it's quite hard for the weeds and the pest animals to get a foothold in there. Doesn't mean they can't, but it's very resistant, and we'll see more about those particular problems later. So you've picked an area of land where you're going to build a sanctuary. You've got to figure out what the threats are to the animals that you'd like to introduce there. And I don't need to go through all the kinds of threats, but there's some pictures there that are obvious threats to native wildlife, and some of them particularly pertinent to Mount Rothwell. So, and sound like a broken record today, these are the biggest threats, without a doubt. And I won't go into in any more detail other than to point out Tasmania as showing foxes being present there. There's an ABC podcast called What the Duck, and there's a brilliant podcast going through foxes in Tasmania and how they weren't there, then they were there, then they weren't there. I believe that there's not foxes in Tasmania at the moment, but happy to be shown to be wrong. So these 2 predators, our native animals don't have natural defences against them. They're both beautiful animals in their right place. They're excellent hunters, and they're causing massive problems for our fauna. So we need to eliminate or minimise the threats, and that's been an ongoing discussion here today. And how it's done at Mount Rothwell is with a fence. We fence out the predators and we get rid of the predators that are inside the fence. So these are the specs for our fence. It takes 1 full-time employee plus volunteers to maintain the fence. And the real reason that this fence works is because every day somebody gets on a quad bike and rides the perimeter looking for breaches, looking for damage, checking that the electrical system is working, maintaining the fence. That's what keeps this fence going. Any guesses for what the biggest breach might be at Mount Rothwell, the most regular breach?
Wombats?
No, not wombats. No wombats in the area, but close. Echidnas. So that's an echidna breach. I like to think that when an echidna goes under the wire skirt, it's like a little ratchet, and once it starts going, it has to keep going because the spikes won't let it go backwards. The echidna breaches also sometimes look man-made. They are so well formed, like a little tunnel. If you wanted to build a tunnel under the skirt, if a person did it, it would look like an echidna breach. My personal record is 4 of those breaches in a 24-hour period. So they're very fast and they're quite regular. When the echidnas want to be on the other side of the fence, they will go under the skirt. I was impressed to see them pushing through the little flap on an earlier presentation. If we provide flaps, they won't use it. They just push through the fence where they want to go through the fence. So, and we just live with them. They belong in this environment too, so it's part of checking the fence daily. Okay, so we put up a fence and we've created a closed ecosystem, and it's a controlled ecosystem as well. And And we all know that ecosystems are complex, and we have in our minds how they might interact. And we would like to establish an ecosystem that looks like that. And we've done that by getting the foxes out, by getting the cats out. What did we forget? We forgot the rabbits. So this is all about learning, and no judgment. This is all about learning, but we took the predators out. The rabbit population exploded. At its peak, it was estimated there were 20,000 rabbits inside Mount Rothwell. And that was under the ideal conditions. Sorry, that was a good season for rabbits. It's not always like that. That particular image there is a recent image of a high rabbit density area within Mount Rothwell, and you can see what they do. So we have a sanctuary with rabbits with native fauna in it as well. We can't use the large-scale rabbit control methods that are typically used because the native fauna, even though they're not burrowing, use the rabbit burrows, so we can't go all out on the rabbit burrows. About half of the sanctuary is rabbit-free. That's after 24 years of constant work. We have one full-time employee who's controlling rabbits, and of course all the volunteers. So we can't use those large-scale control methods, so how do we do it? We do it with these guys. So we have quite highly trained dogs who will show you where the rabbits are, and then it's up to the humans to, and I'll use the proper word, dispatch the rabbits. So you learn their body language very quickly. They'll point to a hole which has a rabbit in it. They won't point to they point to a hole in a different way if there's a native animal in the hole. And it's not unusual to reach into a hole to hopefully pull a rabbit out. And as a trainee, I had a lot to overcome reaching into a rabbit hole. My grandfather is turning over in his grave, knowing that I do this now, but you can reach into a rabbit hole, pull out a bandicoot, pull out a brush-tailed possum, and then pull out a rabbit as well. So our dogs are trained not to grab the animal as you pull it out of the hole. We don't want them accidentally grabbing a native animal. We also don't want them grabbing the rabbits either. We do care about the rabbits. It's not their fault that they're here. We have their welfare in mind, and we dispatch them in the approved CSIRO method. So we also introduce calicivirus to the sanctuary. So we capture wild rabbits live, we inoculate them with calicivirus, and then we release them into large warrens to spread the virus. Remarkably difficult to catch a wild rabbit and keep it alive long enough to do that. I'm told that the calicivirus kills the rabbit within a 24-hour period from inoculation, but also within a 24-hour period of exposure to an infected rabbit. And where we've introduced calicivirus to a large rabbit warren, within a day or two, you can smell that the rabbits are dead. It's a very fast-acting biological control. We also use professional shooters. Where shooting is most effective is maybe I should have said this at the start, we divide the sanctuary into small areas, or the rabbit-infested areas into smaller areas with rabbit-proof fences, and we focus on one area at a time. And shooting is particularly effective to get the last few rabbits out. It's not so effective. It's definitely effective at cutting the numbers, but it also trains the rabbits to be incredibly gun-shy. So we try to restrict the shooting to the last few rabbits within an enclosure. We have to manage public perceptions too, because, make no mistake, we're killing for conservation here. We're killing a species to help other species, and maybe everyone in this room understands why we do that, but we need to manage public perceptions very carefully about what we're doing about rabbits in the sanctuary, especially since we have the public coming to the sanctuary and seeing the work that we do. We'll add that the rabbits that we do dispatch are fed to our quoll population, to our captive quolls. Okay, so that's about rabbit control. We need to optimise the landscape for the natives as well, and that basically comes down to weed control. And when the Mount Rothwell property was acquired, acquired, it was heavily infested with weeds, overgrazed, a huge weed problem. We have one full-time employee who's only on weed control. We have volunteers who have been there from the Earth Sanctuary days who spend their entire week dealing with weeds. And after 24 years, we have areas of the grassy area. We have grassy areas that are beginning to resemble a native grassland. We have good good patches of kangaroo grass and wallaby grass coming through. So it's a slow process dealing with grasslands. We also use fire to rejuvenate the grassy areas. We would like to use more fire, but it's difficult to have the permit at the right time to suit the conditions, to suit people available to do it. So we would like to do more burning, but we do as much as we can. And our burning has been guided by the Wadawurrung people, telling us the best way, time, how to do the burns. Let's see, volunteers. Okay, so we're still working our way through the process of getting a sanctuary ready for the natives, and we've got to do monitoring. So the kinds of monitoring we do at Rothwell, we use lots of motion tracking sensors. We examine scats, tracks and diggings to look at what the species are doing inside the sanctuary. These are pest species as well as the natives once we get them in. We do spotlighting surveys. We do trapping surveys. And the reasons why we do trapping will become apparent in a little while. And we do, of course, vegetation surveys. And again, one full-time employee plus volunteers are doing this sort of work. Okay, so if we're ready for fauna, what fauna do we bring to the sanctuary? Well, there's plenty to choose from. There's plenty of endangered species to choose from, and often it's more of a question of which species have enough interest to garner enough funding to let us do it. Unfortunately, that's how it is. But what we will tend to do is, once a species is chosen, we'll profile the wild population. We'll look at the genetic health of the population, much like Duncan was talking about earlier. We'll look at threats in the wild, and we'll decide if we can manage them in situ or whether we need to harvest individuals and bring them to the sanctuary. And from now on, I'll continue as though that's what we're going to be doing. That particular picture there was before my time at Odonata. How I wish I had been there at the time. This was working with the Air Force to rescue a remnant population of brush-tailed rock wallabies from around Canberra who were being threatened by fire. So, boyhood dream to go in an aircraft plane, but that was before my time. The genetic analysis that we do is done by Dr. Andrew Weeks at CSAR. I've seen his name a few times on the screen here. When we have a population, we harvest individuals, we select founders, and we selectively breed them. And we choose individuals to try and improve the genetic health at all times through this process, because often these remnant populations are genetically compromised. Certainly the eastern barred bandicoots were. Most species are. By the time we get to the point of actually intervening, the populations are low enough that the genetic health is compromised. And once we have a successful breeding program, we release them into the Mount Rothwell Sanctuary or Haven and see how they do. And generally they do pretty well. But then what? We've got species in the sanctuary, we've saved them potentially from extinction, but what do we do now? And we're getting towards the rewilding. Species are incredibly vulnerable in one haven. They're vulnerable to all kinds of things. They can become inbred again. They can become hyperabundant, where their welfare begins to suffer. They eat all the resources that they're competing with each other for resources. They're starting to starve because they've eaten all the resources. Doesn't happen with eastern barred bandicoots. Does happen with the macropods. They will breed as hard as they can until they have nothing left to eat. We also have a moving climatic envelope for these animals. So with climate change, the areas of the world where they're going to do well are moving. Unfortunately, Mount Rothwell doesn't move with it. So as the climatic envelopes are moving, perhaps the species are getting left behind in a less than ideal environment within the sanctuary. It's only talk at this stage, but we're already talking about, instead of having eastern quolls at Mount Rothwell, maybe we need western quolls because they have a climatic requirement more suited to what's expected to happen in the region. That's an area of research that may happen at some point. And it's still a closed ecosystem in a hostile environment. It's not a natural situation. So Mount Rothwell's become a source population in a fragmented meta-population, and Duncan definitely had a better slide of this than I do, but we supply animals to other sanctuaries. There's the three that I've listed there. Because I'm most familiar with these three, there are others. So there's the Tiverton Farm Sanctuary, which Duncan mentioned. That's a working sheep farm in Western Victoria, about 1,000 hectares, has about 5,000 head of sheep on it. It also has several thousand eastern barred bandicoots and several hundred eastern quolls there. Now, there was a question from over here about predators, about needing predators. We put the eastern quolls in with the eastern barred bandicoots to be the apex predator for that population. That's one of the reasons that they're in there. It's also obvious that Tiverton Farm Sanctuary and Mount Rothwell, where there's lots of native mammals, we have a huge raptor population as well. They come and they're an apex predator as well, trying to catch them. Barbalut Sanctuary is near Seymour. That's a recently established sanctuary with southern brush-tailed rock wallabies. Duncan didn't mention, but we have supplied curlews to Phillip Island, bushstone curlews. We have a captive breeding program at Mount Rothwell, and we've recently supplied them to Phillip Island. And of course, continue monitoring. What we're making here is a highly managed meta-population. We have to do the management. We have to decide where the individuals go, whether we stir up the genetics from Tasmania a little bit because they're getting a bit inbred. We find with the brush-tailed rock wallabies that some males are dominating all the breeding, all the offspring are theirs, so sometimes we will catch that male and put him somewhere else so someone else can have a turn to help keep the genetics healthy. Okay, what challenges do we have? Well, the havens certainly serve their purpose of halting extinction, but they have problems. They're expensive. They're expensive in terms of land. You have to have land set aside to be the haven. You have to have staff and you have to have infrastructure. Mount Rothwell replaced their 11-kilometre fence, or our 11-kilometre fence, about 4 years ago. It cost just under $1 million. That was in pre-COVID prices, so who knows what it would cost today. Well, actually, we do know, and it's more. I put volunteers up there as well, not because they're expensive, but Mount Rothwell runs on volunteers, and it's a fragile resource that needs to be managed, just like the animals and the plants that we're looking after. People are keen to be involved, and it's important that we have a volunteer program that keeps them involved, that gives them tasks to do so that they feel like they're contributing, and they are contributing. Even we don't have our volunteers cleaning toilets and sweeping floors. That's a job that needs to be done, and whoever does it is contributing, but we have our volunteers engaged as much as we can in the science of what we're doing, as well as the day-to-day activities. Having been through the volunteer, casual, full-time employee cycle, it's the casual employees that clean the toilets and sweep the floors. Okay. And the big question is can we rewild? And when I put this slide together, this was my answer. Well, we can't. I've changed my opinion somewhat after watching some of the presentations here, but I'll still show you why we can't. These are images from outside the wire at Tiverton Sanctuary. I didn't have to look very hard for these images. Each week I check the wildlife cameras at Tiverton Sanctuary, and it's a constant parade of cats and foxes outside the fence, including in the daylight. That's what's waiting for these animals if we try to just push them back out into the wild. So, what do we do? Duncan got to the end of his presentation with the same kind of question, what do we do? I don't necessarily have the answer, but I do know that time is of the essence for species that are not in the havens or in the sanctuaries, because the extinction is not waiting for permits or funding, and neither are the cats or the foxes. They're out there breeding to their heart's content, and they're ready for us to start feeding them bandicoots. So what do we do? Now, when I do presentations, I say that eastern barred bandicoot recovery was a miracle. And I don't mean it's a miracle in that we save the species by a captive breeding program, by getting the right individuals to breed and then putting them into safe places. That we know how to do that. The miracle is that we got our act together fast enough and enough people worked together well enough to actually make it happen with a species that has a lifespan of 2 to 3 years. So the clock was ticking, and the miracle was that we got it done. But it's also inspiring that we can work together and get things done like that. Sorry, I won't say that. So, what's the future? How do we future-proof these species for long-term survival? And this is where, what do we do? I mean, the focus today has really been on cats and foxes, and certainly my focus. What do we do about the cats and foxes? We can reduce their density so that species will persist. That definitely works, but you've got to keep controlling the cats and foxes because there's nothing reducing their density except for us. So any ideas? I'm happy to hear them. I'm sure we all are. And that's kind of the end of my presentation, but I don't want to end on a sad note. So these are some of the species that we keep at Mount Rothwell. I won't necessarily read out all their names, but they're actually my favourite, those ones. They have such a cute white tummy. Really want to pat it. Southern brush-tail rock wallaby. They almost went out, but we've brought them back. Sugar glider, we don't actually manage sugar gliders, and we're not sure if they were in the sanctuary when the sanctuary was closed or whether they flew in, but there's lots of them in there and they're flourishing and we're happy to have them. This is not an animal, but this is a critically endangered plant that we found in the grassland, and now we're preserving it as well. It's not really in our portfolio, if you like, but it's there, so we're looking after it. It's a gendered plant too, and as luck would have it, we have 24 of one gender. So, as a bit of a side project, one of our staff is trying to get a permit to collect seeds from other populations and maybe get our population to be self-sustaining. Long-nosed potoroos, another species. You want to know why they're called potoroos? That's exactly right. They fit in a pot. They were very popular food for early settlers. Southern brown bandicoot, had that discussed today. Very different behaviour to eastern barred bandicoots. The southern browns are very bold. They're quite comfortable coming up to humans. The eastern barred bandicoot's much more timid. So why are they persisting in areas where EBBs are not persisting? They definitely have different behaviours. Maybe that's contributing. Eastern quoll, which we talked about earlier today. Bushstone curlew, like we've just delivered to Phillip Island. And of course the eastern barred bandicoot, the flagship species. So this is my last slide. This was a video taken from one of our hunters through a thermal camera, and these are eastern barred bandicoots at Tiverton. Now, if we weren't recording, I would have the Venga Bus song playing at the same time. I don't know what they're doing, but I like to think that they're happy. They're frolicking. I mean, they definitely eat insects. Maybe they're flushing insects out of the grass to feeding. I've even had it suggested that maybe they're drumming earthworms out of the soil to eat those. But yeah, I like to think that this tornado of eastern barred bandicoots shows that they're happy to frolic in a predator-free environment. That's the end. Thank you.
You mentioned about eastern quolls kind of filling that role as an apex predator.
Yep.
Do you have much, evidence or observations of them preying on bandicoots? Because you often hear about them preying more so on invertebrates and smaller things.
The question was, have we got evidence of eastern quolls preying on bandicoots? No, I don't. It doesn't mean it's not happening or that we don't have evidence, but I haven't seen evidence of it. I certainly see evidence of eastern quolls preying on rabbits because we know where the eastern quolls are denning and they will leave pieces of rabbits around their den. I didn't mention them because they're not really a focus. We have some spot-tail quolls in the sanctuary as well, who they're kind of rescue animals that we've looked after for a while and then released into the sanctuary. And they're not pets, but we look after them a bit like they're pets, and we often see them with pieces of rabbits. What I'm seeing predating on bandicoots the most are birds of prey. And the reason for that is that the birds of prey often land on top of a fence to eat what they've caught, and then they'll leave the skeleton hanging on the fence. It's like a house of horrors. But and often you can see that they're bandicoots that they've been eating. And getting off topic, this is something I forgot to say. So when we're controlling rabbits, we will have a small paddock, say 10 hectares, that we've got rabbit free, and then we're patrolling the interior fence, making sure the rabbits are not digging in, and the rabbits consistently get back in there, one or two. And it's birds of prey dropping them in. Because the bird of prey will grab a rabbit, fly off, accidentally drop it, goes in. Or lands on the fence to eat it, and the rabbit gets away. So, that's just another little challenge that we deal with.
Thank you for that. I can attest to how difficult it is to get rabbits out of preserves, having worked at our recovery and Mulligan's Flat.
Yep.
Eradicating rabbits from both of those. But one of the things that they did at Mulligan's Flat when they expanded it to Ringaroo was to keep the foxes.
Yes.
Get rid of the rabbits. And I don't suppose you can do that within your sanctuary.
Not in an established sanctuary, but in new sanctuaries we definitely keep the foxes to cut the rabbits. And I don't want to use the word policy, but when we're establishing new sanctuaries or helping people establish sanctuaries, we say you've got to get the rabbits out. So it just means a longer settling period for the sanctuary before you can put the natives in. It's the same, yeah. That's something we've learned. The question here, yeah.
Do you think a statewide bounty on foxes and cats would help?
It sounds like it would. I have seen that bounties haven't worked in the past.
Well, they got rid of wombats.
Oh, yeah. They got rid of the eastern quolls as well. They have tried bounties in the past. I can't remember where I've read this, but it certainly would reduce the pressure, but I don't think it's going to solve the problem. I'm definitely not an expert on this, and I'm speaking out of my field now, but I really think I think the solution for cats and foxes is going to be a biological control. That's how we've dealt with rabbits in the past with myxomatosis and calicivirus. Again, it hasn't solved the problem, but it really reduced the numbers. But can you imagine trying to introduce a biological control for cats? I mean, it's not going to happen. I love cats too. I grew up with cats, but they were always inside cats. But I think that's the solution one day. Bounties,
Bounties plus something else.
Yeah, I think it would help, but it's one of these things that I don't know if politicians and the general public have a taste for it so much. Yeah, like we may establish a bounty, but you've got to keep the pressure on. You can't have the bounty for 12 months and then we're finished. But anything's worth trying. Anything else? Yep, one at the back.
Just on that last point, I would definitely throw my weight behind something biological. Doing that. When we talk about native species, we do have very invasive programs where we're looking at fertility control for hyperabundance. So exploring that kind of work for our pest animals is critical. You mentioned there that extinction doesn't wait for permits and funding, and we could probably throw policy in there as well. But then had the great photographs of the queue of foxes and cats that are waiting to get in. So how much of a barrier is funding, policy and permissions when we look at those photos of the foxes and
Is anyone from DECA here?
Go for it. We've the government out of the room, but...
Well, funding, I don't want to sound like I'm whining and it's only Odenata's problem. There's not enough funding for conservation and environment. I think we all know that. I will give an example about waiting for permits. The spot-tailed quolls that I mentioned were refugees from another sanctuary. They came to us somehow before my time. We needed a permit to release them into the Mount Rothwell Sanctuary, which is reasonable. That they were 4 males, so the risk of releasing those 4 was not high. I think it took 3 years to get that permit. Now, I know that we need permits. We have permits for a reason, and I support that, but sometimes you wonder if it's being applied appropriately. So, I don't know if I answered your question, but
How much of a barrier is it in your day-to-day work?
I think funding is the biggest barrier for us. Yeah. Many of our sanctuaries are not ours. They're owned by private landholders who are wealthy enough to establish their own sanctuary. So there's people out there who want to do these things and they decide to do it themselves at their own property, and they engage with us to make that happen. But as far as Odonata going out and buying a plot of land, we would like to do that, but funding just stops that from happening. There's even... No, I won't go that way. Yep. Sorry. I don't feel as though I've answered your question entirely, but I think funding for us is the biggest delay.
Yeah, I just think we haven't really talked about missions and policy today for very obvious reasons.
Yep.
But good to hear that funding is the key barrier.
Yeah,
Yep.
I think so. Yeah. Any other questions? That's enough. Okay. Thank you.